Hello, I'm Toycat, and when we talk about immigration, we tend to do so on a country-by-country basis. This is really valuable for shaping a national political conversation, but it's not so valuable for answering the question of if people are going to live outside their own borders, where do they generally choose to live? There are a group of people who can live anywhere in the world, and the place they overwhelmingly choose to live, according to this map, is the United States. Seriously, on a linear spectrum that goes from yellow to blue, the entire blue side of the spectrum is just the USA, but there are quite a few other destinations that are somewhat popular, especially compared to their population, 30% of Australia immigrants, for example, and so as a result of that, we can dive into the top destinations for immigrants, try and work out what it is they share in common, and also try to work out why it is that some countries view immigrants, or migrants rather, as this big boom, this big net positive, and some countries view it as this huge burden. For some countries, migrants are a resource they capture and something they value themselves on, and for some countries, migrants are this big burden they do everything they can to get rid of. Why is that these different views exist? Let's dive into it at least a little bit in today's video. Because again, whenever we're talking about immigration, we tend to do so in this lens of like, oh, in my country, immigrants are good, or I believe immigrants are really, great because I'm humanitarian like that, but I would rather see them as a resource. Do you want this resource in your country or not? In the same way that some countries have been blessed by oil, hint Middle East, and some countries have been cursed by it, some countries have been blessed by immigration, and some countries maybe have the exact opposite. What's the deal with that? Let's dive into it a little bit by going back to this map first of all, because looking at it as a map is really hard to see just because of the linear scale here. The USA is by and large the most immigrated country too in history. The three most populated countries on Earth are India and China, which have huge native populations that have built up over genuinely millennia, and the United States consisted of about 1 million people 300 years ago, and now consists of 300 million, and obviously that means that although the official, immigrant statistics say that 50 million people migrated there, the truth is the other 270 million or so immigrated there at some point and then became United Statesians, which is the official term for people from the United States. Trust me, that's true. If you call them Americans, you upset a whole portion of the planet, and we're not going to be doing that in this video. That's every other video on this channel. So a lot of people are United Statesians, and so of course that's the #1 destination, but it's interesting to see that Germany is #2 on this list. That was absolutely fascinating to me. Also, apparently you should choose AutoCAD. Don't waste time using other Canadian dollar alternatives. Anyway, but you can see that Saudi Arabia being second place is a really interesting one people wouldn't expect, because most people would like to move to Germany or the United Kingdom, maybe even Dubai or the UAE or France, Canada, Australia, and Spain, but Saudi Arabia and Russia are the two oddballs on this list, right? Partially because if you're watching this video, you're watching this from the English-speaking world, where Russia is the big bad place with the big bad man or something like that, and Saudi Arabia is the it's literally a monarchy, a religious monarchy at that. They have clerics that decide the laws, and so who wants to move there? The answer is kind of going back to that old question, right? With Saudi Arabia, and in particular the UAE has a little bit of this too, the entire Middle East region has a relatively small native population, and they have a huge burst of wealth, and so they have a lot of migrants, but they're not usually classed as migrants. On the other hand, Russia, I think this is an interesting one. I think this blurs the line between migrant and kind of like not, because although Russia has a really high immigration rate, if you read into why, most of these people come from the former USSR, or the, I guess nowadays it's the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, and so are they really migrants, or are they people who had no choice but to immigrate to the big country? In the same way that, like, if the United States broke up today, and it turned out California's biggest set of, immigrants were all from the other states, would you call them immigrants now? If again, like, literally today, California leaves the USA, are people from the other states of America migrants into California, or are they just people who settled in California and who are now Californian? It gets really tricky really quickly, and honestly, the biggest trick is you got to ignore those questions, because how is it that, how is it that only 50 million people are immigrants to the US? Because you kind of get to decide your own thing as to whether you're immigrant or not, and this is kind of what this list is really kind of talking about some way. Like, when you move to the US, 50 million people say they're migrants, and the rest say they're not. 15 million people say they're migrants to Germany, because you can keep that status for some amount of time, but a lot of people, even like, Turkish is the biggest migrant group for a lot of people to Germany, a lot of those same Turks would consider themselves German after a few generations. Although that's less true in Saudi Arabia, that's also true for Russia, that's true for British people. I know lots of people who are migrants here. The Prime Minister is a prime example, right? His grandparents are from Uganda. If you don't know, the UK has a British Asian Prime Minister. His grandparents are Indians who moved to it's somewhere in Eastern Africa, I think Uganda, and then they moved from Uganda to the UK, and they're British now because they've been here for enough time, British enough to become the Prime Minister, right? And so this moving definition of like, are they still migrants? I mean, at some point they migrated, but at some point didn't we all migrate? Moving back to that whole point. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing to discuss here. But the overall thing that this list has in common is, in general, the top 10 countries are all wealthy, with Russia being the closest thing to an exception. But even then, they were wealthy compared to the other options that their citizens had at the time. The Russian Federation was the richest part of the USSR, and so it's still the same point that you could see very easily all the way up until what, like 14 on this list, and India's not poor by any means. And even then, it's as a percentage of their population, India has just 0.4%, whereas countries like Canada and Australia, who are rich and also have decent immigration policies, are 21% migrants and 30% migration. In fact, according to some estimates, because usually you have to discount the UAE and Saudi Arabia because they're not really migrants, they're people who can work there for a bit until they decided not to. In general, these are the most popular countries for migrants to go to. If you're looking to migrate somewhere, and I had no other clues about you, I would say two of the best bets probably are Canada or Australia. I would say after that, maybe the USA, and then after that, I don't know, do you like history or something? Because then the EU. That would be my biggest like vibe on that things, and that's why when you look at this fun map, EU member states by foreign percentage population, you can see it is really high in general, especially Northwest Europe and the kind of traditional Western European core. The richest countries in the EU all have pretty decent shares of foreign-born population. This is a better statistic than migrant, because, like at some point you can still be foreign, but you can be born in a country and still be like kind of foreign, and you can be born outside of a country and still be very closely related to it. Like if I moved to Ireland, I'd be foreign-born, but also not really, right? So the interesting thing here is you can see that, like, wow, there is a very high percentage for a lot of countries, but in particular, Sweden seems to get a lot of it. That comes up a lot in political discourse. You'll notice that at some point. But also Germany's over here, these countries over here, and you might assume, like, well, these countries have high immigration populations because they love immigrants. But according to this thing I showed you earlier, France and Germany and Denmark and Sweden are nowhere near the top of this. In fact, here's a really fun, very particular poll where it's by YouGov. They asked people, does immigration generally benefit your country more or generally harm it? And in the USA and Britain, it's really close, but most people argue it's like it benefits or they don't really know. Whereas when you start moving to the Nordics, in Sweden, the majority of people believe that immigration is generally harming their country more than it's doing good. And the same is true for France, and the same is true for Finland, and in Germany, it's really amazing. Like the country of the second highest migrants in the world by absolute number, according to all the numbers you can find out there. Again, it's foreign-born usually. According to that, you can see that, like, actually, wow, by and large, Germans are not fans of immigration. They're taking in a bunch of it, but they don't like it. Why would politicians invite a bunch of people from foreign countries in to countries where they're not really wanted? Is a question that I think causes this huge political, wave of discontent in the world. There is a huge resentment for that because, in general, it seems as though rich countries, because what do these countries have in common? They're all rich. If you look at the highest GDP per capita, a lot of these have restrictive immigration policies, but only in the case, if you look at Qatar, you don't really ever become a Qatari citizen. You look at Macau, good luck on that. There's Luxembourg, well, that's probably the easiest choice on the list, but in general, the very richest countries have very closed border policies, but then the next wave of countries after that, so Switzerland or Norway or Hong Kong or the US, have kind of guarded policies, but still will allow a lot of people in. A lot of their economy is based on having immigrants come in, and so it's really hard to argue which way round the trend goes. Is it that rich countries have a lot of immigrants, or is it that countries that accept a lot of immigrants become rich? Again, the USA, you might say, well, they went from nothing to all these people because of people moving in. The population of the US being 2 million would not allow it to be a superpower. If they never had these immigrants, it wouldn't have happened. The same is true for Canada. The population of that Canada would not be worth mentioning were it not for immigrants, you could really easily argue. And so is it that you have to have immigrants to be successful, or is it that when you're successful, you have immigrants? And I would actually argue the second one is probably more true. Like, most people aren't good. There is no way, Burundi would have a really hard time convincing people to move there for $735 a year. That's, what is that, like $58 a month or something? Like, it's more like it's 61 dollars a month, something like that. I don't know that I would move to Burundi for $61 a month. I don't think I would move there for $610 a month even when you get up to countries like this. Convincing people to move for a lesser standard of living will always be hard. These countries won't be successful just by magically turning on the immigration taps, and therefore it seems much more likely that successful countries invite a lot of immigrants. Except I would say it's probably some weird mix of the two, right? To have a really successful economy, you need to have people to fill each role, and in especially richer countries, there's a lot of people who don't want to do certain things. I think the attitude people have towards immigrants generally tends to be, I love immigrants when they do things for me, but I don't love immigrants when I have to do things for them. When they take away from our collective, it's bad. When they add to the collective, it's good. And so if you're thinking from that logic, I would say, just to lay my own cards on the table here, I think that in general, immigration is good, not because on some humanitarian level. I just think if you look at, civilization, look, I've got my fun charts here again. If you look at the average human, we all proceed under the basis that money means something. A lot of people like this, like, nah, money's just fake, man. And it's like, why do we all work then? Okay, people have to do things for other people, and we use money as the basis of that. But even if you just assume that people are doing things for other people for free, then people only work for X percentage of their lifetime, about 50 in the Western world. It's a little bit less than that once you consider people leaving the workforce, but you don't work until you're like 21 or so that entire portion of your life is just worthless. You are of no value to anyone else. When you're in school, you're not doing fun things for people, unless you're a YouTuber, I guess, nowadays. And once you hit 66, I think is the retirement age in the UK, then you're worthless to people after that point too. So this is the average person's valuable lifespan. Apparently, you're Austrian between the ages of 21 and 66, something like that. A lot of people take time off at work in the middle of this somewhere, so you have like maybe a little stretch in there where you're unemployed, for just a little bit though. In general, people are employed for the vast stretch of their life, about half of it or so, and this is great. This means that about half of your work can go to you, versus half your work going to society to deal with these 21 and under year olds and 66 and above year olds. But if you think about, like an immigrant coming into the country, here's what they look like. They do these 21 years in another country altogether. An immigrant is, when you birth a new person into the world, they can be productive for 5 years or something like that. But if you just take someone from another country, forcibly or not, you could kidnap them, I guess, but we generally use voluntary immigration, their life starts magically without any understanding at age 21 or at whatever age their career starts, and then they just work until they retire. And the best bit is a lot of them, first of all, if you come from a lower life expectancy, boom, there's less time in your retirement, but also a lot of people go back home to retire, which means the rest of this is being done somewhere else, and you can just have the pure workforce of someone. Immigrants are such a good deal for a country on this like work balance level, and the only way that it wouldn't be is if they're, they're taking a lot more from the system than they're giving in certain ways. The only ways that it can't be are when you have countries like just to give the UK's example, we had 1 million people enter the UK in the last year, which is great. 560,000 people left, but still 500,000 more people are in the UK just from immigration than last year. That's ignoring births, that's ignoring everything like that. And so there's a new 500,000 people, and so you'd assume, what is that, like how many more people is 500,000? Like a city the size of like, I feel like like a city the size of Leicester and Nottingham. I feel like this area, I feel like you've got like 500,000 people around here. An area this size needs to be built with a new museum, a new National Space Center, a new couple of Tesco's. You need new universities to house all those people, new cricket clubs, new hospitals, new whatever else. Like, maybe roads and buses and train lines and tram lines. You need all this new infrastructure to host these people, right? As a country's population grows, so too do the needs of its people. But I think the reason that people would get upset is because 500,000 people will enter, and then how many houses will we build? Like 140,000. So each of those immigrants is living in 3.5 people to a house. Not very great. I think the reasons to be upset are when people, if people did bring their children here, hypothetically, if you were to, immigrate here as a child and then leave as soon as you turn 21, just take advantage of the education and healthcare, you'd just be a net burden. That would be bad, right? If you were to come here just to retire and you wanted like our retirement benefits, you'd be a net burden too. I think there are all sorts of situations where it can be bad, and there are situations where the government doesn't deal with it in the way that they're meant to. But that's my personal kind of view on the thing. I think, like, as an economic just numbers game, it makes sense that you want people for their productive years and you don't want them for their unproductive years. However, the thing is like this house building graph proves, or like the net immigration figures prove, the truth is that for a country to be successful, it does need a higher population and more productive people doing more productive things. But also, for it to be like palatable to more people than not, you need to have one, more general acceptance. I mean, if you look at this, for example, like the most accepting of immigrant countries tend to have the most immigrants on some level, or maybe actually because they have so many immigrants, they realize how accepting they can be. If you look at North Macedonia, no one has chosen to immigrate to North Macedonia. Like 7 people. If you're watching this video from North Macedonia, I'm sorry, but you probably agree with me, right? I mean, how many North Macedonian immigrants are there? Very few. Most of the people who go to North Macedonia are probably from neighboring countries like Serbia, where they're probably not even considered immigrants to begin with. Whereas if people are generally accepting of them, more people would like to go there. And so I think the overall answer to the question of like, well, why are immigrants picking those destinations? Partially, it's based on it. The biggest one is going to be their economic success. This graph proves that so one-to-one. And it's not even funny. There's not even a real debate here. The only outlier to that is Russia, which is like, is that even really an outlier? If they were rich at the point they could move, and they weren't, in the Cold War, you weren't really meant to move from the communist sphere of influence to the capitalist sphere. So like, if you start looking at it, you realize like Turkey's the closest one we have to that. And even then, it's only 6 million people. It's less than, it's 7.2% of the population. And even then, they happen to be next to a big old war zone. Because, there's, I can't believe I haven't shown this yet. I'm sorry. I failed you all. You can actually show, there's actually, we can look up the biggest, like, immigrants from a country. And it's interesting to realize that, like, oh, yeah, when we go by share of total population, which I think I clicked, but it didn't. There we go. Migrant share total population. You can see very different results, and also very wealthier results too. Like Macau has a 62% population share. What were they on this list? Were they second, right? Yeah, 62% population of immigrants. But then I think there's a more interesting thing of like, well, once you start to get to realizing this, people have high immigrant shares because the native population are doing really well per capita, but the immigrants aren't. And then you come back to the whole, like, is it bad for the immigrants? And then you just have to say, well, they're choosing to do it. But is it, should the wealth of a country be shared with people who are not from the country? Really fun debates that happen all over this thing. I don't know what the answer is. I just know the basics. And here's the stats. There's my opinion on the fact that we probably want people not to be worthless. But again, I come at things from a pretty economic point of view. A lot of people tend to watch these videos and say, but Toycat, you're forgetting that humans have a value besides dollars. And it's like, yeah, but you can't really cover those on a geography value. Like, on a geography channel, what are we going to say? We're going to say, yeah, on the one hand, the net value of a child moving here is really low. But, I mean, children are the future, and aren't they so cute? They're not cute. Objectively, children are ugly. Like, they are, you wouldn't look at, like, a heart. You ever seen a baby pigeon? You haven't. Pigeons, they're a cute, fun little animal. Baby pigeons, spawn of Satan. Should I prove that, actually? If we type in baby pigeon in Google Maps, what do you think happens? Baby pigeon. Baby Pigeon Limited in Kirkstall Road, Leeds. And there's no baby pigeons here. I mean, we should confirm that, really, shouldn't we? There's no baby pigeons here. Would be a terrible place to raise one. But they're ugly. Look it up yourself, and you realize, yeah, children are objectively terrible. And I think making a qualitative value on that, it's really hard. Whereas it's much easier to just say, yeah, there are some countries that people move to. How do I feel being on the 4th on this list, the 5th on this list? Honestly, as long as I feel like it's like anything, right? Like if you have someone who comes to a place and just kind of like if you have a friend who just sits there in the corner, doesn't do much, you'd be like, nah, could you do better? Could you maybe like help out a bit, or like, at least financially contribute to the pizza? Don't say, oh, I don't want pizza, but then when the pizza comes out, like, have a bunch of it. But also, there are all sorts of things that at my country, your country, the world's countries could do better, and maybe people from outside that country could do that. Maybe we could build a bunch of hospitals, or new rail or road projects, or transport infrastructure, or whatever else. We should be doing these things. Take advantage of the million people you have coming in every year, and use them to do something cool. But that's just my take. I don't know what yours is. Let me know in the comments. This will be a spicy comment section, I guess. And yeah, I have a new fun series starting soon. Make sure to subscribe so you see it. I'm just kidding. Don't subscribe. This channel's bad. Goodbye.